Cade Weston had never been a man who sought trouble, but trouble, in the untamed territory of the Arizona frontier, often had a way of finding the honest man who simply wanted to be left alone. His spread, grimly named The Last Stand, was not a declaration of defiance, but a simple statement of fact. It was the last habitable piece of land before the mountains turned to unforgiving dust, and he intended to live out his days there, beholden to no one. He was a rancher of quiet strength, his morality etched as deeply as the sun lines on his face. He valued loyalty, hard work, and the clean silence of the wide-open spaces. That silence was broken one sweltering afternoon by a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, not the usual lowing of cattle or the crack of distant thunder, but the unnatural sound of human weeping, thin and choked, carried on the hot, dry air. Cade rode hard, following the sound until he reached the far boundary of his property, where a rough corral fence marked the border with the vast, lawless territory controlled by Silas Thorne, the most feared and ruthless land baron in the county. What he saw there was a scene of calculated, brutal cruelty that turned his gut to ice. A woman, young and fair-haired, was strung up and tied to the topmost rail of the fence post. She was barely clothed, her delicate dress ripped and soiled, and her wrists were raw and bloody from the thick ropes binding them above her head. She was sobbing silently, her body trembling with shame and exhaustion under the unforgiving sun. It was an act of public humiliation meant to terrorize, a message carved in suffering for anyone who dared to cross Thorne. As Cade dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry scrub, the weeping stopped, replaced by a deep, shuddering intake of breath. The woman lifted her head, her face tear-streaked and bruised, but her eyes, though full of terror, held a core of defiant fire that astonished him. She didn't beg. She simply stared, awaiting the next violence. Before Cade could speak, before he could even reach for the Bowie knife at his hip, a voice, cold and slick as river oil, cut through the oppressive heat. "Well, well. Look what the buzzards dragged in." Silas Thorne himself rode up from behind a ridge, flanked by two of his heavily armed henchmen, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. Thorne was a large, fleshy man whose power lay not in muscle, but in the chilling absence of conscience in his eyes. He stopped his horse just feet from Cade, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He nodded towards the fence. "That there is Elara Vance. She was getting too damn curious about my paperwork. Tried to run. She's learned her lesson. But she needs finishing. Needs to be silenced for good, so the rest of the county stays in line. I'm feeling generous today, Weston. You finish it. Pull it down. Finish her." The command hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Pull it down. Finish it. It wasn't just an order to kill her, it was a demand for complicity, a test of submission. If Cade obeyed, he would be stained by Thorne's cruelty, tied forever to the Baron's brutal authority, and his lonely life would continue in terrified peace. If he refused, he would be declaring war against the most powerful man in the territory, turning his quiet ranch into a battleground, risking his life and everything he owned. Cade looked at the woman, Elara, whose desperate eyes were locked on his. He saw not a source of trouble, but a victim of pure evil. He thought of his own code, the unspoken oath he'd made to himself to live a clean life. He thought of the silence he had sought, a silence that would now be deafening if it were bought with a woman's blood. He drew his knife, but not the Bowie. He drew the smaller, sharper skinning knife from his belt. "I won't be finishing anything for you, Thorne," but it sounded true. "This is my land. And you'll remove your cruelty from it." Thorne's face went from smug amusement to cold, murderous rage in an instant. "Fool. You just bought yourself a hangman's rope. Get him, boys." Before the two henchmen could spur their horses, Cade moved. He didn't fight Thorne, he didn't even draw his pistol. He dropped to his knees right beside the fence post, focusing only on the ropes. He sliced through the thick hemp binding Elara's wrists with two rapid, clean strokes. The freed ropes fell away, and Elara, her muscles seized from the ordeal, collapsed instantly. Cade caught her and lowered her gently to the dust. The henchmen were momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the refusal. Thorne, roaring in fury, drew his own Colt. But by then, Cade had Elara shielded behind him, his own pistol now leveled at Thorne's chest. "She stays with me," Cade stated. "You touch her, you touch the bullet I'll put through your heart first. Now ride out." The standoff lasted only seconds. Thorne, surprised by Cade's willingness to die for a woman he didn't know, decided the matter wasn't worth the immediate risk. He spat a curse onto the ground. "You made a grave mistake, Weston. You think you saved her? You just condemned her. And yourself. I'll be back to collect my property and my toll." Thorne spurred his horse and rode off with his men, leaving Cade alone with the wounded woman and the heavy weight of a declared war. Cade scooped Elara into his arms, noting how light and fragile she was, and mounted his horse. The ride back to the last stand was slow and torturous. Elara was silent, her body tense, staring blankly ahead. Back in the cabin, she ate sparingly, her eyes following Cade's movements with the alertness of a caged bird. She was physically mending, but her spirit was broken, locked inside the memory of the fence post. Cade did not press her. He treated her with quiet respect, ensuring her privacy, letting his actions speak for his intentions. He knew that trusting a stranger was a risk, but in the face of Thorne's monstrous act, trust was the only currency he had left. On the fourth night, the silence finally cracked. A nightmare woke Elara, a stifled scream that tore from her throat. Cade was instantly at her side. She clung to him, weeping, burying her face against his chest, repeating a single, frantic phrase in a barely audible whisper: "He's going to kill them. He's going to kill them all." That was the start. Slowly, painfully, the story poured out over the following days, cementing the bond of shared danger between them. Elara was not just a nosy witness, she was the clerk for the county land office. Thorne had been systematically defrauding homesteaders, running them off their land, and filing false claims. Elara had found the ledgers, proof of outright murder and land theft, and had tried to run with them. Thorne's men had caught her, but she had managed to hide the ledgers before she was strung up. She hadn't just been tortured for running, she had been strung up to bait the true owner of the land, someone Thorne wanted to kill. The realization hit Cade like a physical blow. Thorne hadn't wanted Cade to kill Elara, he had wanted Cade to finish the job and take the blame for the public execution so Thorne could search the area without suspicion. Cade's simple act of compassion had shielded Elara and the secret she carried, turning him into Thorne's primary obstacle. The slow-burn connection between them deepened into a fierce, protective loyalty. Elara saw in Cade not a hero, but a good man who had willingly sacrificed his peace for her. Cade saw in Elara a fierce, intelligent spirit that refused to be broken, a woman who carried the truth that could dismantle a monstrous power. The love between them was forged in the fire of shared peril, a quiet, unspoken promise to fight together. It was a love built not on stolen glances, but on the shared weight of the secret ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin, the proof of Thorne's atrocities. Thorne's return was inevitable. It came a week later, just before dawn, with the unmistakable sound of 50 horses cutting through the cool morning air. This time, there was no pretense, no conversation. Thorne wanted the ledgers and the deaths of Cade Weston and Elara Vance. "Burn the ranch. Bring me the woman," Thorne bellowed from outside the firing line. Cade had been preparing. He had barricaded the windows, fortified the door, and filled every water bucket in the cabin. He looked at Elara, who stood beside him, no longer trembling, her eyes bright with a dangerous calm. "You still have time to ride out," he urged, leveling his rifle. She shook her head, holding the shotgun Cade had taught her to use. "No. I'm not running anymore. You chose me over your peace. I choose you over my fear." The showdown lasted through the morning. Cade and Elara fought side by side, a symphony of deadly efficiency. Elara, using her knowledge of the surrounding terrain, called out the flanking movements, her shots deliberate and precise. Thorne's men were well armed, but disorganized, fueled by greed rather than purpose. The ranch took heavy damage, bullets splintered the wood, and a small fire erupted in the barn, but the cabin held. The climax came when Thorne himself tried to storm the door, thinking they had run out of ammunition. He burst through the weakened hinges, only to be met by the cold muzzle of Cade's rifle. "It's finished, Thorne," Cade said. "But not the way you wanted." The gunfight ended with Thorne wounded and his remaining men retreating, dragging their injured. The ranch was scarred, the barn ruined, but they were alive. Elara's fate was irreversibly changed. She was no longer the silent victim strung up on a fence, she was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had defended her truth. Cade's fate was also changed. His solitary life was over, his heart bound to the fierce woman beside him. He helped her load the essentials onto their 2 remaining horses, the secret ledgers tucked safely into his saddlebag. They rode away from the last stand as the sun reached its zenith, leaving the bullet-riddled cabin behind. They didn't ride toward the nearest town to turn in the ledgers, they rode north, towards the mountains, towards the open, lawless spaces where they could be free to choose their own destiny, their own justice. Elara, riding beside him, her back straight and her gaze fearless, smiled, a genuine, radiant smile born of freedom and purpose. The rancher had made his choice, a simple act of cutting a woman down from a fence post, and in doing so, he had pulled down the entire rotten world of Silas Thorne and changed her fate, and his own, forever. They were 2 fugitives now, but they were free, bound by the memory of the fence post and the promise of a long ride into a life they would build together.